Welcome to the Policy and Services meeting of Tuesday, December 14th. I'm going to chair the meeting tonight in place of Councilmember Koo. Could the clerk please call the roll?
Yes, sir. Board Member Stone?
Here.
Board Member Tanaka?
Here.
Chair Du Bois?
Here.
For the record, we have a full board of 3 present.
Great. I think we have 4 items tonight, but we'll start with oral communications. If the clerk could help me, if there are any members of the public that want to speak, please raise your hand.
Yes, sir. It looks like we have hands. 1 second, and I will unmute them.
Yeah, I'm going to switch over to the computer in a few minutes. I'm on my phone currently.
Yes, sir. Okay. Jennifer Landsman, you should be able to unmute and speak for up to 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mayor, council members. Good evening. As you know, many Palo Alto residents are affected by deleterious aircraft noise and air quality pollutants from Bay Area airports. This month, the FAA lists several airspace actions with potential negative impact on the city and citizens.
I apologize for that. It appears she's being promoted to panelist accidentally, so 1 moment.
Sure. So I'd like to remind that in 2019, I mentioned that there are several publications by the FAA which are considered final orders, federal actions. I'd like to remind that in 2019, to avoid situations with federal actions happening without public involvement and to be timely about responding to FAA actions, Council voted on a fast track process. From the staff report in 2019, I quote, "The city manager's office and the city attorney's office have partnered to develop a plan for monitoring procedural changes that could potentially affect aircraft impacts on Palo Alto and develop responses, including contacting the proper authorities with our concerns, and if appropriate, preparing to file a lawsuit within the appropriate statute of limitations period, typically 60 days from the issuance of an FAA order." So the FAA is very obscure about their final orders, but in the absence of a final order document, it has been said that the publication date of a new airspace procedure is when the statute of limitations begins. So I would like to submit this reminder that the city committed to a fast track process for procedures affecting Palo Alto, and the 60-day clock may have begun for various publications. My expectation and hope is that the city is looking carefully at what has been published to date, especially now in December, the effects of responding or not responding in a timely manner, or not using the given windows to appeal for adequate assessments and mitigations from the FAA, especially because there is no venue to receive FAA attention to citizens' concerns, and anyway, sending grievances to a roundtable forum such as happened with Pirate was futile. The next 2 months are a clear and unique opportunity to reach out to the FAA. Palo Alto is within its rights to pursue engagement for the procedures that have just been published and about the importance of the FAA documenting realistic projections of noise and air quality pollutants. Thank you very much for your time and the work you do.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. I don't see any other public speakers. So we're going to close oral communications and move on to our action items. The first item tonight is an update on federal and state legislative advocacy and discussion on our legislative guidelines. Chantel, do you have that one?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I have with me today representatives from Vanscoy as well as Townsend Public Affairs. And we did a recent legislative update. So I was imagining today just kind of a quick hit of information, just quick summary of this year and what's to come in 2022 from both of them. And we'll of course take Vanscoy first because it's much later on the East Coast than it is here in California. And then in terms of the legislative guidelines, each year the Policy and Services Committee comes up with the recommendation for our legislative guidelines and sends that to the City Council in January or February. And the City Council adopts those legislative guidelines as well as the utilities guidelines for legislative affairs at the same time, so that we have guidance for the legislative work we do as city staff, as well as our consultant advocates for the city. The past few years, the guidelines have not changed significantly year over year. So I'll just point out a few quick things that we have updated for the proposed 2022 legislative guidelines, and then I'll turn it over to our legislative advocates. So this is all in attachment A of the report. So this is packet page 5, if anyone is following along specifically. So we had a council discussion in June this year related to sort of the legislative process that the city wants to do and our strategy for being most effective in Sacramento as well as DC, particularly Sacramento. So we just added that reference to the council action from June to the legislative guidelines as part of our guiding work. Additionally, we added reference on this foundational principles part of the document, saying that we would pursue grants as it makes sense, of course. And then going to the next page of the legislative guidelines under environmental, we added supporting proper disposal of recyclables once removed from Palo Alto. This has been a priority that the City Council has emphasized a few times, of knowing that we're doing our best to do recycling in Palo Alto, but worried about where things go beyond the city limits. So there's been some work done by Phil Boble and that team, but my understanding was the City Council wanted that to be one of the pieces of guiding legislation that we continue to work on. So we added that. And we had a little cleanup under the financial section. So instead of just protects the funding levels of city services, but adding funding sources, as there have been a few bills at the state level, which Nicolo could speak to, that are addressing sales tax or other types of tax revenue. So just emphasizing that our legislative advocates will be really focused on protecting those funding sources in addition to the actual funds. And lastly, I believe this is the last one, on the following page under the housing section, we added homelessness to the list of providing funding. So originally it said provides funding for affordable housing and infrastructure. We added on there affordable housing. Homelessness was the piece that was added on, as that's something that we have been advocating for at the state level to continue to have funding available to the city, to cities specifically for those type of works. And we included the utilities legislative policy guidelines, which have been through the UAC already and approved by them earlier this year. So with that, the recommendation from staff is to push forward the legislative guidelines, but I will turn it over to our legislative advocates to just give a brief overview of what's to come. So David, representing Vanscoy, will go first.
Thank you, Chantel, Mayor and council members. It's great to be with you this evening from DC. The Congress is trying to wrap up the year tonight, potentially, but over this coming week, ultimately. And I'll touch on that in just a moment. But my colleague, Steve Palmer, regretfully was not able to join me this evening, but I will go ahead and touch on 3 quick topics and then dive into infrastructure, because that's what we continue to hear about and what I know you're particularly interested in as well. But one, because I said there was work being done tonight, the debt ceiling is something you've heard a lot about. Debt ceiling is being addressed tonight. Senate earlier tonight passed a measure that would increase the debt ceiling by $2.5 trillion to take care of United States obligations through 2022. And the Senate is actually going to pass, the House is going to pass that bill as an immediate follow-on late tonight. They still haven't passed it. So it will be a particularly late night for the House tonight. On appropriations, the federal government, as you likely know at this point, is under a continuing resolution to keep federal funding going under previous fiscal year funding through February 18th, 2022. That keeps funding levels going at a fairly good level, and it also buys Congress more time to keep the federal government funded as Congress debates those bills. The Cahoots program and Roth building, both funding that would go to projects and programs in Palo Alto are still in those bills. One last thing before touching on infrastructure, just wanted to remind you that the administration continues to emphasize Justice 40, and it's the whole of government effort to ensure that federal agencies are working with state and local governments to deliver at least 40% of the overall benefits from federal investments in climate and clean energy to disadvantaged communities. You're going to continue to hear about this initiative throughout the President Biden's administration. And this will be a regular theme of both how does the administration promote clean energy and promote addressing climate, but also helping disadvantaged communities. With that said, let me give a quick update on infrastructure. As you know, at this point, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA, or even you have heard it as the bipartisan infrastructure bill. It passed on November 15th, and it provides $1.2 trillion, as we discussed, in infrastructure spending across 5 years, and that's $550 billion in new money. So it truly is historic funding. The federal departments and agencies, since it's been signed into law, they're starting to formulate spending programs and plans for each of these programs. We've gone over a lot of them. There are a lot of programs that they're working on. And unlike the American Rescue Plan, this funding is not intended to distribute immediately. It's going to be distributed over the next 5 years, but even the first sign of it could be as long as 6 months away. And so there's it's going to be a extended process to get this funding available to send out. And it's important to remember that IIJA funds are not a quick infusion. It's a long-term investment, but we're going to continue to work with staff to identify priority projects that will fit into IIJA programs. So we're not waiting on the agency announcements, and so we can be able to identify those. But some of the ones that are going to be of likely interest and continuing interest are the former Tiger program, or the RAISE program. There's $7.5 billion in there in the past implemented legislation. There's $2.5 billion for electric vehicle charging. Chantel brought up recycling. There's $75 million in recycling education and outreach programs. The list goes on, and I'm happy to talk more about them. But ultimately, the federal agencies will be going through the implementation and creating program over the next few months, but also going into 2022 and over this next year. Now let me move over to the Build Back Better Act, or budget reconciliation, the human infrastructure bill. And that bill is actively being negotiated. It previously passed the House, and it's currently held up in the Senate. But Majority Leader Schumer continues to say that he would like to have the bill passed before Christmas. Now that's a big ask. It's going to be difficult to pass the bill before Christmas, but that continues to be the goal. It's still unclear if Senator Manchin from West Virginia is going to move forward with his support, at least over this next week. But he almost daily is at the White House, definitely daily, communicating with the White House about reaching a final agreement. But some of the issues that are holding up a final agreement are concern about the high spending in the bill, the potential impact on inflation, as well as some of the tax credits, which I'll touch on in just a second. I actually heard, even though those are some of the major issues, there are actually about 20 issues that are still behind the scenes trying to be worked out on this bill. So there are several areas that need to be worked on before final passage in Congress. One of those that will impact Palo Alto and its residents is the state and local deduction. That tax deduction that would raise to 80,000 with this bill. It's a sticking point of where to exactly put that amount. But there are several programs in there as it's with it being billions of dollars, there are trillions of dollars, excuse me. There are many programs from climate change to electric vehicles to retrofitting buildings as well, and affordable housing that was mentioned earlier as well, workforce development that will help the city, help residents as well. Just in closing on the Build Back Better Act, Congress is going to look to taxes on corporations, taxes also on certain wealth levels as well, and then also global corporation taxes as well. There will be 15% minimum tax. So not to bore you with the details, but just wanted to touch on a few of those pay-fors that are being proposed. And lastly, what's next? As I mentioned earlier, implementation of these bills, at the very least, the IIJA bill, infrastructure bill, will be moving forward over these next 6 months and year, as well as appropriations. And we're going to continue to work with the city on not only city and the congressional delegation for that matter, on not only this current fiscal year, but also the next fiscal year, to make sure that the city is once again competitive to secure funding, as well as to get full funding and strong funding for the priority programs. So with that said, I'm happy to answer any questions you have tonight, and great to be with you.
And Mayor Du Bois, do you want to have the state update as well, just quickly? Or
Yeah, if David doesn't mind, let's do the state, and then we could just ask you both questions.
Awesome.
Sounds great. Mayor and council members, Nicolo DeLuca, great seeing you all. Of course, my trusty sidekick, Andres Ramirez, is here too. I think last time we were in front of you was right at the end of session. So just quick highlights. As David was saying about the federal side of things, last year, or this last fiscal year, state had an amazing surplus. A lot of that was to address COVID-related concerns and issues. Moving forward, and again, I kind of think numbers are becoming devalued. The state's looking at a $31 billion surplus, and that number could very well go up. So this upcoming year will be similar to this last year. We'll see funding for very important programs related to homelessness. So Home Key, on behalf of the governor, that's definitely going to be a focus. And then on the legislature also, climate resiliency. Something new that, based on a lot of our conversations that we've had with the governor's office and leadership in both houses, we expect to see in the governor's budget, which will come out on January 10th, also something about crime. There's been a big rash of retail robberies that you all are familiar with up and down the state. So we've heard about some proposals, haven't seen anything in writing, so that's definitely something to flag. So as we move into 22, we've got a lot of things going on. Currently in the assembly, we've got musical chairs. We've had a couple assembly members have either been appointed to being judges, some have stepped down, some are running for congressional seats. So we'll see some changes primarily in the assembly throughout the year. Something else is the new swing space. As you all might recall, the current physical capital structure is going to be remodeled. So they're going into something called the swing space, which is about 2 blocks behind the current Capitol. That's new because there'll be some committee hearings in that structure, but then also the floor votes and floor session will be in the old Capitol. So it will be a lot of moving and back and forth. Coronavirus is still here. There could still be potential for legislation on requirements about vaccinations and what have you. As you recall, towards the end of the session, Assemblymember Wicks and Assemblymember Lowe put forward a proposal that never got a hearing, but that very well could come back. And then also redistricting. This is a really, really big issue right now. not just impacting the Assembly and the Senate and the congressional seats, but also legislation. And what I mean is Anders and I are doing a lot of check-ins, not just with our delegation, but others. Traditionally, this time of year is when we're talking about what's your bill package, what are we looking at, what are we considering? Having some discussions on that, but a lot of discussions are taking place on redistricting. What's my district going to look like? Who are my new constituents going to be? Based on that, what are some of my legislative priorities going to be? So that's kind of a quick nuts and bolts of where things stand in Sacramento. There's also, as it relates to the budget, the legislative analyst was predicting a surplus over the next 3 to 5 years. Due to the GAN limit, which is legislation from 1978, you cannot program out that far, and there's certain requirements as to how those funds must be spent. So all that to say is similarities to this past year, well, there'll be a lot of money, but then what will the focus be on? What will some of the priorities be? And then we've got musical chairs in the Assembly. So with that said, Anders and I are happy to answer any questions and then discuss other further additional items.
Thank you. And that concludes our presentation, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, David, Nicolo, Andre, it's good to see you all again. Just want to check, is Councilmember Tanaka here?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, there you are. Good. Okay, do you or Councilmember Stone, do you have some questions, comments? Councilmember Stone?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, I have a few questions. So I guess based on that last point you talked about, Nicolo, with the $31 billion surplus, are you hearing about any plans at all about reintroducing greater affordable housing funds? I mean, love to see if the state was talking about restoring programs like the local redevelopment agencies that were ended in 2011 during the Great Recession. It's a lot of money. Is there talks around there?
Councilmember Stone, great seeing you, great question. A lot of discussion on homelessness, mental health, and affordable housing. Just based on the last 2 weeks, that's coming up a lot. As it relates to redevelopment, I don't see that having legs this year. Department of Finance really balanced their books based on once redevelopment was dissolved, and each year we hear things about redevelopment 2.0, but what's kind of taken that role has been different ways of doing tax incentives, creative financing, infrastructure districts, and what have you. What's clear is that programs such as Home Key and direct allocation of dollars to cities and counties and continuums of care, that will continue. As to what level, to be determined, but I do expect the governor in his budget proposal on January 10th to talk about Home Key and mental health. I was on a call today with a handful of affordable housing advocates. They will be pushing a large ask, maybe 3 billion, maybe 5 billion, on the traditional affordable housing programs and projects that need a reinfusion, the multifamily housing project and things of that nature. Definitely there's room for the city to weigh in, and there's some space on these coalitions to help push. And I think what would make the most sense is once we see the governor's proposal in January, decide which elements we really like to weigh in on and put some force behind that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Do you have any sense of what the state's hesitancy is on actually providing that funding? I mean, it's just
the redevelopment funding.
Yeah. I mean, there's just constant talk from the state about needing to increase affordable housing, and yet they continue to push it off onto cities like we have the funding to be able to make that happen. And I think things like Project Home Key are great. Palo Alto's taken advantage of that, but to be able to do what Palo Alto needs to do, and what Palo Alto wants to do, is going to require state and federal funds, and which is not being provided that. So do you understand what the hesitancy there is? I mean, is it just...
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to be a historian. It goes back to when Jerry Brown was governor in his first year, he was facing a massive deficit. You had all that pressure on Prop 98 for the schools. We were in a big recession, and they they balanced the state budget by dissolving redevelopment. I don't see them going back to that because it's really something that they got rid of and they've taken away. I agree with you. I think probably the number one complaint that we hear with no redevelopment funding is there is no legitimate ongoing source for affordable housing. And affordable housing, as you all know, I mean, your AMIs, it could be AMIs at 120, 80, 70, 100, which are, working families. And that's kind of been the typical or common complaint about the state, and especially in surplus years. So one of the Senate budget committee members said it well to us was last year, a lot of last year's budget were things that we needed to do due to COVID, help small businesses, help tenants, help landlords. And he said, we've gotten through that. Now this year, we look at the surplus as sort of our surplus. What are the programs we want to build out? What do we want to focus on? What's really the direction of the state of California now that we've gotten our second surplus in front of us and have addressed some of the concerns from COVID?
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I appreciate the history lesson. That was that was helpful as well to get that context.
Well, and it was funny. And I mean, when Governor Brown was the mayor of Oakland, I worked for him, and there's a lot of shots, and Chantal might remember about like, hey, you used redevelopment funding for the Fox Theater. This is a great project. This helped revitalize downtown. The state could, we can't get rid of the RDA funding. He's like, yeah, that was then. This is now. I was like, oh. So anyway, other stories to say about him when he was the governor during those years, which seems so long ago when the state was really, really looking at a bad deficit.
Well, yeah, the politicians never change their minds, right? All right. So a couple of questions then on some of our legislative guidelines. So I want to first focus real quickly on the police category on page 7 of the staff report. Is it inferred or would we need to add language regarding supporting government action that would provide for cities to have the discretion to decrypt police radio for greater public transparency? I mean, is that something that under these guidelines? I don't know if this goes to you, Nicolo, or staff. That is that broad enough for us to be able to address an issue like that?
If Ms. Gaines also wants to chime in, I mean, I think you all have been clear on the radio frequency issue, and I think that's definitely something that the city has been vocal about the last 2 years. And so definitely something that we want to raise our delegation. And then if that's something that's introduced, something that we would jump on supporting pretty quickly.
And I'm just reading through the information itself. I don't think the way it's written right now that it's expressly clear that it will be emphasizing that type of transparency, just as I'm reading it. So something regarding that, if it's of interest of the committee, I would say it may be good to just add a line.
I was going to jump in. I know there's some new bills being discussed, but if we want to include it, maybe we could just say expansion of requirements regarding police data and communications or something. But again, if Nicolo's on top of it.
Yeah, I think.
Can you repeat that again, just to make sure I jotted down correctly?
Well,
Expansion.
we have a sentence in there already about requirements regarding police data. And maybe we could just say data and communications.
Thank you.
All right, so Chantal, you think that would be clear enough to address the encryption issue?
I think so. Yeah, it's definitely enough to make it clear that that's something that we will continue to have conversations on and continue to work towards. I think so. I'm thinking in my head that the DOJ's direction, I couldn't remember if that was the state or the federal level, is my main hesitancy, but I think this gives us enough to guide us either way.
It was the state, I think.
Okay, great.
Yeah, that's my memory as well.
Okay,
So
great.
I get kind of on that kind of idea. I mean, is there no I guess the staff report stated on page 4 that like the existing guidelines would not allow topics like the Carbon Dividend Act to be addressed without city council adding it to the legislative guidelines. So I mean, does that really mean that there's no mechanism in the updated legislative guidelines that allows for city council to directly request support and advocacy on a particular bill?
So the way we've treated the guidelines historically, and this is just my second year doing them, so I am learning a lot as I go as well, is this is sort of the umbrella of the type of things that we will support, oppose if that's how we write it, or ask for legislation on. So some bills are very clearly within all of the items here, because this is, I'd say this is pretty broad on most of these topics where we can stretch them to either meet support for a bill or be opposition for a bill. Some of the areas that are like a step beyond, that's that gray space where when we receive the bill information, we're like, yeah, it kind of hits the guidelines, but it's a step further than what we think we have the authorization from council to do. So that doesn't mean that it's insurmountable and that council can't support the legislation. We would just want to come back to council just to make sure that you have the opportunity to weigh in on that specific bill. So like the carbon fee meets a lot of our sustainability goals, but then specifically some of the language in the bill, my understanding from staff, it stretches a little beyond what we think that we have the authority to do. So that's just an example. I'd say that doesn't come up very frequently, even with the state bills. The mayor will send information my way, or this committee will bring something up in our quarterly legislative updates. And most of the time things are fine, but in that gray space, it's just safer for us to go to the council just to make sure we're representing the city appropriately.
Okay, that helps. That makes me feel better. Thank you. And then just two other quick questions. So regarding number 3 of the foundational principles, does the word governance at the end of that section encompass issues such as like the city's authority to control its own zoning and land use?
I'm reading and scrolling and trying to unmute at the same time. I'm doing a great job. I think yes, and I think we also have something on here that specifically references local control. That's what I'm trying to scroll and see. Give me a second. I think that was something in the housing section. Let me look.
Yeah, on housing, the first bullet about that.
Thank you.
Okay, you're right. Okay, great.
So
And
between those two, we have between those two and the council resolution last year, which made it very clear that local control is a priority. We understand that as a guide. I think the devil's in the details sometimes on some of those bills where it's not as cut and dry as it may seem, but between those three, the foundational principle, this housing bullet point, and your local control resolution, we're pretty clear and have enough authority to take positions where we need to.
perfect. And then one final question. I'm just kind of curious about how some of our foundational principles are consistent with some of the legislative guidelines of items we support government action on. So just for example, like the first bullet point under transportation on page 5 of the staff report states that the city supports government action that deters single occupancy drivers and alleviates local traffic congestion. I mean, I think we all do, but I'm just concerned, could that be read to support state mandates that would restrict a local agency's ability to mandate parking requirements for new construction, as the state has attempted to do several times?
We've never taken it that way. We've taken it more as our sustainability goal of supporting alternative transportation modes and or EV. So we're taking it from how the context clues of Palo Alto's conversations have guided us to date.
All right, great. Thank you. And then are we going to need will we need in the motion then when we approve this, will we need to include that language on the police radio encryption, or was that not necessary for the motion since you jotted that down?
Yes, please include it.
Okay, perfect. Then we will. Thank you.
Thanks. And, I probably should have gone to the public there, so we will do that now. If any members of the public would like to speak on this item, just raise your hand. All right, I see one speaker, David Cole. David, you should be able to talk.
Yes, thank you very much. Pertinent to the discussion at last night's City Council, it's important to have the potential impacts to our SCAP council priority listed on all staff reports. And I see here we have very little on that. It's maybe listed under the environment section, but it points up the need for really having this be front and center as part of our top priorities, and that it's lacking at this point. And to that issue, if any of the speakers from the federal or state representatives could speak to our opportunities that might be available with respect to funding our carbon reduction and electrification plans, that would be great. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And I'm not seeing any other public speakers, so we'll go back to council. Councilmember Tanaka, do you have any comments, questions?
Yeah, I do. So thank you guys for the update. What is the estimated dollars going back to Palo Alto from these large, what do you call that? The Build Back Better bill, and other large bills coming through the federal side. Do you guys know? Do you guys have any estimate as to how much this will mean for our city?
Councilmember, thank you for that question. We don't know, just because the framework of the programs have not been created yet, but we are actively pursuing those numbers. Some of those are formula funding. So, we're able to identify what would be going to the state through some of the formula funding that would be coming down to Palo Alto. But for a lot of this funding also is discretionary. And so there'll be an opportunity to pursue it from Palo Alto, for Palo Alto. But ultimately, many of the programs are still coming together.
Okay. Well, I assume you guys are going to kind of stay on top of it and let us know when we're eligible for wherever funds might be available.
Absolutely. We're working with staff on that front, and we will keep you updated both on when the funding becomes available, but also when some of the framework also becomes more available.
And so you guys track like potential funding opportunities for us, and then you kind of inform staff, and so we get our application in time and all that kind of good stuff.
Yes, Councilmember, we track funding opportunities both for these large bills, but also for discretionary programs on the various priorities for the city.
Okay.
Part of that work, Councilmember Tanaka, as well as staff assessing the specifics on the funding opportunities, just to double check our eligibility, as well as the efforts that are necessary to apply for the funds and receive them. So part of that, all of that is included in the evaluation process.
Yeah. Okay. I've heard that Palo Alto is kind of like a net tax dollar exporter. So I'd like to try to, turn that a little bit more to an importer if possible for us. So I think we should try to, apply for whatever seems to be possible for us. But it sounds like you guys are trying to do that. So I appreciate that. My second question is around, I saw that the producer price index is like record high rate in terms of inflation. And then just even the consumer price index is also, I think, the highest in 30 years. I've read that something like 40% of the dollars right now have been printed in the last year. So I guess how do you guys see this? How do you guys see this kind of impacting these kind of large spending bills and things going forward? I mean, I know you guys can't predict the future, but how do you see things going down in terms of being able to handle the fact that, like around here in Palo Alto, we're $5 gallon gasoline, right? And we've seen, just about everything go up a substantial amount. I mean, at least here it seems to be way higher than CPI. So what does, how much more money can we print? How many more big spending bills can we do before, inflation starts to get out of control? I mean, I guess you guys can't answer that, but I'm wondering, how do the lawmakers there feel, and how much longer can this go on before? Do you guys have any insight into this?
I'll go ahead and jump in on that question. Thank you, council member, for that question. It truly is the $1 trillion question, because that is the dollar. Those are the dollar amounts that members and senators want to spend these days. Unfortunately, that is not stopping. The concern over inflation is not stopping these large bills from moving forward, but there is an increase of members and senators starting to raise concerns over what the impact is. So, for example, I mentioned Senator Manchin raising concerns over the price of the spending on the $1.75 trillion, the Build Back Better Act. While there is a lot of good provisions in there, there is raising concern from not only Senator Manchin, but other members as well that he's speaking on behalf of, that are saying, all right, perhaps, we need to do something on these issues, but perhaps, spending without reservation, you could say, perhaps that's not the solution. And so, but unfortunately, they see it as tomorrow's challenge and not today's, to put it bluntly.
Okay. Yeah, I personally think that inflation is one of those things that it hurts the poor the most, actually, right? Because the poor tend to have most of their wealth in cash, and most of their income comes in cash, versus the wealthier people tend to have more of their wealth in assets, which are less impacted by inflation. And so I think a lot of these programs have good intentions, but I just wonder, like, in terms of the people that get impacted most are actually the people who need the help the most, ironically. So I'm just wondering if you see, how if you read the tea leaves, right? It seems like you don't see any slowdown in this. You see that it's going to keep on going, at least for now. Is that how you're seeing it?
That is correct. At least for now, the spending is going to continue. And on one side, it's record level spending. On another, from another perspective, it's record level investment. But the spending of the federal government is going to continue. Absolutely.
Okay. And at what point do you think it will stop? Or do you think it will never stop?
At some point, there obviously is going to have to be a recollection on the spending, but I think your guess and anyone else's guess is as good as next, because it's been a trend that's been under. It's not just Democrat administrations, but if you look at the Trump administration, when Republicans took the majority, they spoke out against significant spending, and billions and trillions of dollars were spent under that.
Oh, I don't think this is a Democrat or a Republican thing. I think this is just a general issue, right?
Exactly. So there's no end once a new administration takes over, whoever that is, in 2.5 years or 6.5 years, that there is not going to be a change necessarily with the change in administration in the future.
Yeah, I was having lunch here in Palo Alto with it's kind of like a Christmas party for, like, a lot of the people there were retired, and I was just surprised by how many of them were really concerned, because a lot of them are on fixed income right now, right? They're retired, not working anymore, and just how many of them really felt the pain. And I think a lot of these programs have really good intentions, but again, it is being paid. I mean, it seems like it's not a tax, but it actually is a tax. It's a tax on everyone who owes cash. And, especially people who are on the bottom end of the socioeconomic ladder, and retired people are being hit the hardest. And I don't know if that's being reconciled at all, but it's something that concerns me, at least. Okay, that's all that I had. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I mean, council member touched on it. It sounds like there's really not an answer, but I was curious, like, is there any anticipation of how those IIJA funds will be distributed? I mean, are they going to flow down through the states, or will cities be able to apply, directly, or it's just totally unknown at this point?
Thanks, Mayor, for that question. No, we do know as far as certain funding programs that will be going through the state versus going or for the city to be able to apply on discretionary funding. We do know those and how exactly that works out beyond discretionary versus formula. Some of those details are being worked out, but we do know, and we do have a list that we are tracking of programs that the city will be able to go after directly, whether that be through certain agencies, Department of Transportation, Department of Energy, EPA, list goes on, or if it's going to be coming through the state. And so we are continuing to track that.
One of the things, Mr. Mayor, that we've done is really focus on areas we've known the city has historically wanted funding for, particularly grade separation is always at the top of our list.
Yep.
But as other programmatic funding comes up, we're also evaluating those. It seems there's always more strings attached to some of the programmatic things. So we just really want to be diligent with all of the city's time that'll be involved in if we do apply for the funds and what it means for reporting later on the funds. But yeah, David and his team is being very diligent with keeping the list and keeping us ahead of
Yeah, okay. And on the inflation, I think there's a Fed update tomorrow, which will be interesting to see how they're reacting to inflationary pressures. Yeah, so I just thought I'd cover some of the areas of interest. I think you guys are aware, but just to maybe emphasize them. You know, as Greer mentioned, we were working on our home key project, and I think we hope to have that submitted early on. And then I don't know, David, if you know what home key is, but yeah, okay. And then I did hear that Josh Becker, our state Congress, State House, whatever, is potentially working on a new bill around police transparency and alternatives to radio encryption. And so I think we'd be interested in supporting that as a council. Obviously, we're talking about grant opportunities in general. Fiber to the home is the other one. I know there's a lot of money for rural fiber broadband, and just wondered if either of you or any of you are seeing programs that might apply to a city like Palo Alto, where it's not a rural situation.
So, Mr. Mayor, I'm happy to take that one. As you all recall, one of the budget trailer bills at the state legislative level a few months ago, Senate Bill 156, did allocate several $1 billion for overall broadband connectivity up and down the state. There were kind of two tranches to that. One tranche was for middle mile infrastructure that would essentially create and dig fiber up and down the state of California, north to south, and kind of serve as an open access main connection point for communities to hook up to that kind of broadband. In addition to that, they did allocate $2 billion, and it is going to go through the California Public Utilities Commission for municipalities. Will be eligible to go after these dollars, as are joint powers authorities. So if a municipality, through a formal MOU does form a JPA with another municipality nearby or some other stakeholders, that them as a group could go after these funds. But essentially, right now, the Public Utilities Commission is in the process of overviewing a staff draft for the program in which jurisdictions, cities, various other entities can apply for that funding. And essentially how it's going to work is each county throughout the state of California is going to get a certain proportion of that $2 billion. Currently, the CPUC is overviewing 3 distinct funding formulas, which will then allocate based on that funding formula. Counties will get a certain allocation. So, Santa Clara County could get allocation A, B, or C, as would every other county. What is called the RCRC definition would result in the most amount of funds that Santa Clara County would be eligible for. Once that is done, there will be an actual process with solicitation for applications. As I mentioned previously, for jurisdictions or joint powers authorities, and even investor-owned utilities to apply for that funding within a county. However, I should note that local jurisdictions, at least based on the draft staff report at the CPUC level, local jurisdictions will have a leg up because it states that if a local jurisdiction wants to provide some sort of internet connectivity to their residences, they have less incentive to turn profits as opposed to an IOU.
Yeah, I'm surprised IOUs are eligible. That's
Yes. So once again, this is at the current moment just a draft report from staff at the CPUC level, and I'm more than happy to send it over to Ms. Gaines and Mr. Shikata, and they can distribute amongst the council for your review. But at the present moment, as I mentioned, this is kind of just a draft report that staff at the CPUC has. So that is ongoing, but I think it could prove beneficial for all of you to see that, to just kind of see how the process is working its way out. And then once that is kind of finalized, the counties are given allocations, then my understanding based on the draft report is that the ability for local jurisdictions to potentially access these funding sources for projects in their municipality would be on a rolling basis, and they would be due every quarter. So more than happy to provide Ms. Gaines and Mr. Shikata some supplemental information to then share with you, Mr. Mayor.
great. That was very thorough. Anything at the federal level that would apply to a city or?
There is actually in the infrastructure bill that recently passed out the IIJA, there is a enabling middle mile broadband infrastructure program through the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. There's $1 billion there for middle mile infrastructure. There also the city is eligible to directly apply for that funding and go after that. The biggest pot of funding in that bill is actually the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. It's $42 billion, but that funding will be going through the state. And so those are the two biggest pots of funding that were included.
Okay. And then, we mentioned railway grade separation. That's a big one. Implementation of our climate action plan. So we're really looking to start to implement some programs in the next couple of years, next year, beyond what we're already doing. And, I think we cover a lot of it in that environment section of our guidelines. And then we have the utility section as well. And then I was just curious, Nicolo, if you see, are there going to be a lot of housing bills again this year, or going to get a bit of a breather?
Mayor, I feel there will be a good amount of housing bills, but not like last year or the year before or the year before. One legislator we asked, we're like, hey, housing again? She's like, I don't know what more can be done. But I do suspect there will be some housing bills, just not at the frequency that we've seen. Mayor, I also want to touch upon grade separation. Very aware it's really, really important to the city and the region. The feds are great and they gave the state a lot of money on transportation. Unfortunately, the two houses can agree with the governor's proposal as it relates to high-speed rail, but that's something that's definitely going to kick off in the beginning of the year. Discussions on the transportation trailer bill, of which grade separation will be part of it. It just depends how much and in what different programs, but that's certainly something we see on the horizon, primarily January, but more than likely in February. So we'll definitely work with Ms. Gaines and the city manager on how best to position this city when these different pots of transportation dollars are coming out.
Yeah. And you probably know this, but on the housing side, I mean, there's been a ton of changes and, cities are scrambling to update their ordinances to reflect that. And it really would be nice to have a little bit of time to see, how people adopt them, how they're used. And it's kind of hard when they're constantly in flux. So if you can communicate some of that, it's like let's wait and see how some of these things, work.
I'll happily communicate that. In fact, as when Andres was presenting, I was sending a note to Senator Becker's ledge director. So definitely happy to reinforce that and raise it up as a priority.
Yeah. And then super quick, mostly for Chantel, I think, questions on the guidelines. What do we mean by saying we want strategic weighing in? I wasn't really sure what that meant.
I used the language that we had in the staff report and the council dialogue in June, but it just sounds strange. So I totally understand the question today. But in June, we had discussed it as instead of the sending a letter for every piece of legislation, particularly at the state level, that we're really trying to be most effective in what we are sending letters or going to do additional advocating on based off a variety of factors. So that can be what the bill is, the legs that it has, its a possibility for passage, who the bill is sponsored by, others supporting it. So there's a lot of things that goes into whether or not we weigh in on a bill, even if there are some bills where we just fundamentally don't agree with them. If they don't have legs, it's really not worth the effort we're going to put into saying that we don't like it. So that the strategic weighing in as described in June was just saying, like, let's be, I hate using the word in a definition, but strategic in how we approach our dialogues and conversations and advocacy platform.
Got it. Okay. And
So
then
I have a link there for that reason, because otherwise it is without context.
And then, so we're not really updating anything on our utilities legislation. And I think most of it is written pretty broadly, so it kind of works. The discussion about the carbon tax in the staff report. I mean, the utility guidelines say that, we want to advocate for cost effectively reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So we don't think that covers the idea of a carbon tax.
I can follow up because this item has to come to council in January anyway, so I can spend some more time with the utility staff between now and then, if that's okay with the committee.
Yeah. And this would go to council for approval, but I guess it could go on consent, I guess.
It can go either way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Last year, I can't remember why, but it was action. I think there were specific interest in weighing in on SB 9 and 10 in 2021. So we put it on action, but it doesn't have to be on action.
Yeah. I mean, I think, so I don't know. I think the council would probably be interested in the carbon tax. But I'm not 100% sure. So I'm not sure what the majority would be.
If you want to just put that note in the motion as well, that's fine for us. So it's also clear as direction. That's fine.
Okay. All right. Well, I think it's time we should start to wrap this item up. Councilmember Stone, you have another comment?
No more comments. I'm just going to offer a motion.
Yep.
So I move that we recommend the city council approve the 2022 federal and state legislative guidelines and add language to the police section of the guidelines. And so I guess it would be, what line is it? On line 3 there, expansion of requirements regarding police data. I would recommend we add and communications, including radio encryption.
Okay. Anything else?
No, that's it for radio.
What do you think about this carbon tax support?
Oh yeah, sorry, I'd be happy to add that as well.
I mean, do you think a majority of council is interested in that?
I think enough to have the discussion at council. I would imagine we'd be able. I would imagine that we could get a majority of council on board.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess it would be D. support for the Carbon Dividend Act. Was that good, Chantal?
Let me just check the name.
Be the Carbon Dividend Act, I think, for the.
Yeah.
Yep.
Word dividend sounded really funny when you first said it. So that's why I was looking like, what's the name of this? Yes, that one. That's good.
Okay, I would second that if that's your motion.
That's my motion. Thank you.
Any discussion on the motion?
I don't need to speak to it.
Yeah. All right, so let's go ahead and vote on it. Councilmember Stone,
Yes.
Councilmember Tanaka,
Yes.
and I'll vote yes.
Mr. Mayor, one more question. I'm sorry. Is the intention for the committee for this to go to consent?
I believe so, with a 3-0 vote.
Okay, great. Just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Yep. All right, well, thank you to our advocates. Good. Thanks for checking in tonight. Appreciate the update.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Time.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, council members.
Good night. All right, so we'll move on to item number 2, which is review and approve a task order for the Office of City Auditor to conduct wire payment on the wire payment process and controls. Kyle.
Good evening, members of the Policy and Services Committee. This is Kyle O'Rourke, the City Auditor speaking. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. We have 2 items on the agenda tonight, numbers 2 and 3 in the the committee packet. The first of which is review and approval of the task order for us to conduct a wire payment process and controls review, which I'll cover here first. As you may recall, that you've likely seen this graphic 3 or 4 times at least at this point, but this shows how we parsed out audit activities in our initial audit plan, which you all approved roughly a year ago. We sort of had 3 phases of audit activities, and if you look at sort of the timeline, we are getting into that phase 3 category. Ultimately, what we're recommending is adding an audit activity before presenting our audit plan. I'll get to that in a moment. That audit activity is a wire payment process and controls review. We're noticing many cities, local governments, and other governmental organizations are subject to more and more frequent attempts at wire fraud. Some examples of that are sort of email impersonation. So the city AP department might receive requests to change bank routing information or receive fake invoices with attempts at receiving false or fraudulent payments. Similar schemes happen over the telephone and text messages as well. I'm sure we as individuals receive these sorts of attempts as well via email or sometimes over the phone. I have clients where false payments have been wired. We had a prior client a couple of years ago who wired $1 million for a construction project after having improperly changed the bank routing information. Some of those funds were recoverable, some of those were not, but ultimately this is sort of an attack that many governments face very frequently. So as I mentioned, we're recommending that the Policy and Services Committee approve this audit activity now in December so that we can begin the work as quickly as possible. This audit activity itself will indeed be on the next audit plan that we will be bringing to Policy and Services in February. But we don't want to wait 2 months or 2 months plus once we get council approval to initiate this activity. It's important enough for us to bring it to your attention today. And we, Baker Tilly, are recommending that we get started as soon as possible. Some of the audit objectives are taking a look at controls and determining whether or not the controls that are in place are adequate and operating effectively. Those controls, of course, being related to approval of wire payments in accordance with city policy. We also want to take a look at user training. Of course, this is an area where human error ultimately is the leading cause of those fraudulent payments. We want to make sure that city staff are properly trained, understand what to look for in emails, and make sure that they are aware of the appropriate policies and that those are operating effectively. So again, taking a look at training to ensure that all staff are properly trained and know what the policies and controls are. So you can see in your packet the actual task order itself, and I'm happy to answer questions about it. Ultimately, this is a small to moderate size audit activity, but of critical importance given it's centered around preventing wire fraud. The ask today is for you all to approve the task order, which will ultimately go to council at a subsequent meeting. So I went through that pretty quickly, but available, of course, to answer questions and have further discussion around this topic.
Okay, thank you. We'll see if any members of the public want to speak to this item. If you would like to speak, you could raise your hand. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands, so we'll go to council. If there's any questions, comments, or motions. But Kyle, I guess I just have a kind of overriding question, I guess. So this is $54,000, about 240 hours work. Is that actually doing training for staff, or is it like recommending stuff the staff will need to do themselves?
So we'll take a look. It's not us conducting the training. We'll take a look at the existing end user training and make recommendations to enhance that program.
So, I mean, you've kind of identified the issue. I know it's not a huge project, but I'm kind of even surprised at how large it is. I mean, is it the kind of thing that now that our finance department is aware of, that they just need to follow existing procedures better, or are you actually looking at like changing some of the business processes?
Hard to say. I mean, definitively at the moment, we will take a look at existing practices and if necessary, make recommendations to enhance them. So it's possible that we will indeed make recommendations to change processes and or implement new or different controls.
Okay, so where is the bulk of the time going to be spent?
So we will actually do process walkthroughs. So there will be sort of a best practice comparison, what our existing practices versus what we would say what should be in place. In addition, we'll conduct actual testing. So I would say there's a good chunk of hours where we'll conduct sample-based testing, look at logs associated with changes to payment records to ensure that changes to AP records were appropriately made. So existing controls are operating effectively. So to conduct that.
So when you say testing, will you actually try to expand the department and see if you can get some money? I mean,
so in this exercise, we do not intend to do that. I will say,
okay.
So by testing, I mean we'll actually select a sample of transactions, and in all likelihood, we'll select a very large sample, and make sure that the controls were operating effectively. That's ultimately how we determine operating effectiveness. So that's sort of sample-based testing, sort of the traditional auditor approach to that. Interestingly, that what you're recommending in terms of sort of a faux phishing scheme, not something necessarily that we're definitively going to do, but at the February Policy and Services Committee, we are going to bring forth a cybersecurity audit program that will include cyber-related testing, potentially that sort of item you're discussing, potentially also internal and external penetration testing. So the package, I guess, inclusive of this audit activity and forthcoming ones as well, will include more IT-related items.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and make the motion that we approve the task order.
Second.
Thank you. Do either of you have any questions or comments?
No, I always appreciate your reports and your presentation, Kyle. Very thorough. So thanks for all your work.
Okay, so let's go ahead and vote. Councilmember Tanaka, sorry, Greg, I can't hear you.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes, now we can.
Oh, okay, sorry about that. Kyle, so we had a wire fraud issue earlier. How much money was that again?
Oh, sorry, I thought we were voting. Do you want to go ahead? Sorry.
Yeah, I was saying something. I thought you were calling on me. I didn't realize I was muted.
Yep, go ahead.
Kyle, are you there?
Yes, so the city
Okay.
was subject to an incident of this nature over the summer, I believe. And city staff might want to chime in and comment that the dollar amount was in the $50,000 range.
15?
50.
Oh, $50,000 range. So this fix is going to be more than what we lost.
For us, for that specific incidence, if you're comparing it 1-to-1, I understand your point, but the purpose is to prevent future activities of this nature. And so we're thinking about these types of activities moving forward.
Okay. How much total have we lost in wire fraud?
I can't speak to that answer. I can say, though, that I'm aware that the city has been subject to 2 or 3 additional attempts since the initial one that was discovered over the summer. So it's a recurring incident. I can't speak to the total dollar amount.
Okay. So as far as we know, we've only had one of these in the history of the city, or does staff? I know Kyle, you may not know, but does staff know? Like how many of the incidents have we been subjected to?
I do not have that information, Councilmember Tanaka.
Okay, seems like a kind of relevant for trying to decide. I was actually kind of also surprised by the cost too. I thought it was a bit high, but yeah, I definitely don't want this to happen. But it seems like how many? I mean, how many? I imagine we do a lot of wires, right? Like rough. Do you know? Does anyone know how many we do roughly a year?
I can't speak to the exact number.
Okay. So I assume for the incident that happened last time, corrective action has been taken by personnel to prevent it from going on again in the future, right? Is that true, or is that a wrong assumption?
The Administrative Services Department, along with others in the city, are conducting an internal investigation and seeking to identify corrective actions. Yes. So our role is to be the independent objective observer of that process, as well as to do testing of operating effectiveness of controls over a longer period of time, likely over the past 12 months.
I think my headset ran out of batteries. Can you guys still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So so we don't know how many wires we do, or what percentage of wires have been subjected to wire fraud. We know of only one incident that this has happened at, and it sounds like, I mean, let me ask you this. If that same wire fraud, like they try to attempt it, the same kind of, maybe not the same exact wire, but the same kind of methodology or MO, would we fail to catch it, or would we catch it this time? Do you guys know? Or you guys don't know?
I can't speak to that or give you a probability, and that's why we're recommending conducting this activity. We want to ensure that the probability is very low, if not 0%.
Okay. So you guys think then that if somebody used the same kind of MO to do a wire fraud, staff has a chance, some
It's not a zero chance, maybe perhaps low, but not zero, maybe even high. You guys just don't know. Chance that you guys would still, that another 50K, 100K wire could happen incorrectly. Is that what I'm hearing?
We want to make sure that that does not happen. That is correct.
I guess what I'm trying to assess if this is going to happen again. Would this happen again with this service, or would it not? That's the thing I'm trying to figure out. Like,
I think that's the point of this task order is we don't know if it's happened more or not, and this is going to review the business processes to add checks to prevent it from happening.
And Councilmember Tanaka, I know you're focusing on the $50,000 piece to this, which is important, of course. We're also worried about larger payments. This could happen with a more significant dollar amount, and that might factor into your sort of assessment that I think you're making right now.
I'm just trying to understand how often does it occur, right? Because we're asking to spend 50, like we're asking 54K just to prevent a 50K incident. I'm not sure if this is the first time in the history of the city, or it happens, every year. I just don't know, right? And it seems like nobody here knows.
Well, Kyle, I think what you're saying is the city doesn't know either. That's why we want to do this work. Is that correct? I mean, there's no guarantee that we caught a person doing this every time. So I think that's part of the point of this review.
Okay, so it might have happened every week. We just don't know, right? And so the point of this is actually for you to also see if there's been other wire frauds that we just haven't caught even. Is that what you're trying to do also?
We want to take a look at, yes, that's part of it. In addition, we want to understand that when this happens, somebody reaches out for changes to their vendor master record, that city staff go through the appropriate channels to make those changes. So if somebody reaches out and says, hey, we have a new address, we have a new contact, we have a new email address, or in this case, we have new bank routing information, that the folks in the AP department are handling those requests appropriately and in accordance with the city's established policies and controls, and to evaluate those policies and controls for potential enhancement.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, in general, I like the idea. This thing's kind of expensive for, for the problem, but maybe it's happened again. So, but it would have been nice to know if, how often this has occurred, right? But I guess you guys don't know, and that's part of the point of it. So, okay, I understand. Thank you.
Well, Councilmember Tanaka, perhaps it'd be worth just chiming in that on behalf of the administration, we do support the city auditor's scope and engaging in this task order. This really is, as might be described, as basically independently verifying the sufficiency of the controls that we have in place. As pointed out, we are aware of one incident that has occurred, and that other than that, as Mr. O'Rourke pointed out, there have been unsuccessful attempts. And in some ways, this is an issue that is somewhat very likely to be identified because of just the nature of whether payments are received by the vendors or not. So that said, we do believe this is an appropriate and valuable service to be provided to the city.
Okay, I just want to make sure the solution doesn't cost more than the problem. That's what I'm trying to get at. And it sounds like right now we don't even know. So probably it's a good idea to do this.
I think that that's a mischaracterization, Councilmember Tanaka. It is a verification, again, independent verification of our systems and that they're working as intended. And
well, so tell me then. I understand it costs. There's a 50K wire fraud issue. This is going to cost 54K. So in this case, the solutions cost more than the problem, but maybe the problem is bigger. So I guess how am I mischaracterizing that? What am I missing here?
that what we're really looking at is independent of any single incident. It really is a systemic review and verification of existing controls. So
what am I mischaracterizing? Because all I said that this is costing more than a problem, and why is that mischaracterization?
Because the problem is really a verification of the system. The problem is not a single isolated incident. It's really making sure that we're executing on our programs as expected. And
okay, I just don't see what you're saying. I'm mischaracterizing. I just don't hear it.
Because again, you're describing the problem as one incident, and this is not an issue that we're simply looking at as an isolated incident. We're using this as an opportunity to check the the effectiveness of our existing systems. And again, this is something that goes back in time, goes forward in time in terms of our process, and simply one that it's a good health check for us to make sure that our controls are operating as designed.
Okay, well, in general, I like the idea, but I still don't agree with you. That's mischaracterization. So
Well,
I have to push back on that.
If you feel this way on this issue, wait till you come to the next agenda item. I think you may have the same conclusion, but it's nonetheless, I think, again, on behalf of the administration, we believe this is a valuable activity.
Okay, well, I don't agree with what you said.
Councilmember Tanaka, I would just add that, you're pointing out questions that we need to ask as part of our audit process. And traditionally in this sort of audit engagement, we'll ask many of the questions you're asking right up front. How many wires, what's the total population we're working with, what systems are involved, what are existing processes. That will enable us to refine the work plan itself. So the $54,000 figure you see in front of us is the not to exceed. We will do everything in our power to deliver for less than that.
Sure.
So if indeed it is a smaller population, a simpler process, we'll adjust accordingly.
No, I think you have good intention, so that's why I would support it. But I'm just kind of surprised tonight we don't know if this is occurred before. I mean, I would think if we know we have this occurred before, or this is the only time, but I would have expected, or just some sort of stats on, well, hey, we process 10,000 wires a year and only one has happened, but it is what it is. And so it seems like we definitely need to do this. So I understand where you're coming from.
The last thing that might be helpful, and I think this is unsaid so far, this is intended not only to be, backward looking, but also intended to prevent these instances from happening before. When this happened, I did a lot of outreach for our public sector team, and we have 400 professionals. So I reached out to roughly 6 or 8 partners at Baker Tilly and talked through this, and all of them being public sector financial auditors or consultants, and all had stories, 2 or 3 each, of clients that have gone through this. So, this isn't about the one isolated incident. This is about what's to come and continuing to advance and make progress in terms of our processes and controls to prevent the 100,000, to prevent the $1 million issues that could happen.
Yeah, no, I'm already sold on. I'm just saying that some of the basic information I would think we would have known tonight, but it is what it is, and it probably illustrates a need for something like this.
Okay, so let's go ahead and vote on the motion. Councilmember Stone?
Yes.
And Councilmember Tanaka?
Yes.
Yes, and I will vote yes as well. Okay, so now we're on to another audit item. It's to review and approve the initial public safety building construction monitoring report. Kyle?
Yes, I'm resharing my screen. So as you may recall, one of the audit activities in our approved audit plan is monthly monitoring of invoices and change orders associated with the public safety construction. We've come to the point where we've issued our first memo and we've covered every invoice to date. So I guess, I know this has been a couple months in the making, but as we've pushed this back, we've continued to update and conduct this sort of monitoring. with the intent of issuing these sorts of status updates is what they're called in the document over time. I would say as part of this presentation, I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Bob, who is one of our construction auditors. You'll see this report looks a little bit different. He's going to spend a little bit of time during this presentation covering the, or really just orienting everyone to the status update that we'll see in the months to come. And of course, like any of our audit activities, maybe a little bit more glaring in this case, this is a draft report. We don't consider it final until it's ultimately approved by council. So I don't foresee there being any changes necessarily to the deliverable itself. It's just technically in draft format until that happens. So that's why the watermark and et cetera sort of exists at the moment. Bob, I'll go ahead and drive the slides if you want to get started.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. Happy to be back in front of everybody again, speaking with y'all. So I think it's important too, just to spend a little bit of time giving an overview on the scope of the construction audit that we are performing. So that scope is essentially to review the billings and change orders submitted by the contractor, the construction manager, the architect, and the inspector of record each month to verify that they're contractually compliant and that all the project expenditures are properly supported and verifiable. So our program itself, it always starts with a review of the contract documents. So we've gone through each of these contracts and extracted the key terms such as billing and change order authorization and documentation requirements. And from those, we develop testing procedures. In this case, we developed testing procedures specific to each of those contracts. And as Kyle mentioned, and everybody knows, for this specific project, we're conducting our reviews on a monthly basis. So we collect the current period invoices and change orders that have been approved by Public Works and perform our review. So we verify the invoices are calculated correctly. We look to see the previous amounts rolled forward correctly. And for items that are billed on a cost reimbursable basis, we reconcile the underlying cost support to the amounts billed to the city and verify the costs are contractually allowable as well. We also do a full cost reconciliation on any new change orders for the period, which involves reviewing the supporting documentation and verifying the change orders were priced according to the contract terms. We look at things like labor included on the change orders, and we tie the labor rates being charged back to the approved labor rate schedules. So each month, once our review is complete, as Kyle already mentioned, so we draft a status update that is included in your packet tonight. And so I'll kind of walk through what that communicates, a little later on. So the results of our team, so they're shared with the Public Works Department. So Holly, Brad, and their team monthly, and any observations that we do have are openly discussed so they can be promptly resolved. So one thing to point out as well too, it should be noted that our review is a secondary review, and it is not and was not intended to be part of the invoice or change order approval process. So any exceptions noted during our review are raised with Public Works, so then they can work with their contractors and consultants to resolve them on a subsequent billing. So this review essentially then is designed at being a risk mitigation tool to verify that the controls in place are really functioning as they're intended. So that's a pretty high level overview. Any questions at this point before we move forward? Okay. So right now I'm gonna. Okay. So right now I'm gonna. Okay. So Brad, I'm going to turn things over to you and Holly at this point then to kind of walk through some of the invoice and change order approval processes and controls.
So as Brad and or Holly are coming off mute, just to be clear, Bob just covered our scope. This slide is internal processes that are conducted by the city itself. So we are sort of independent objective from independent of the process. But we did want to point out the existing sort of control environment that the city has in place. just so everyone on the line sort of has a full understanding and understands the full breadth of controls and that are in place to mitigate risks associated with this project. Sorry, Brad, go ahead.
Oh, we're waiting on me. I was just going to say that Holly's prepared to walk us through some of the internal controls, but thank you, Kyle.
All right. Thanks. Holly Boyd, Assistant Director of Public Works. So this slide outlines what Public Works staff looks for on each invoice and change order. This is actually general to all of our projects, but there are some specifics for public safety building project because we do have a construction manager. So as each invoice and change order is submitted, we look for the validity of the change order request to ensure it's actually extra work and not covered in the contract documents. We check for accuracy and scope of work. We check for arithmetic errors. We check for allowable billing rates per the contract. This is pretty typical for consultant contracts that have hourly billing rates for each member of their design team. And then we check the bid item quantities. So as we get these and we process them, there's a table on the bottom of the slide that goes through what we look at, who sees and reviews these contract invoices. So first it goes for the public safety building, it goes to our construction manager, which is the Nova partners. They review it and check it. And if there's any issues, they send it back to the contractor to address. Once it's clean and approved, they send it to our project manager and they review it, and then goes to our project engineer. Then it goes to the management analyst for processing, and then accounts payable cuts a check. So that's for our invoices. For our change orders, pretty similar, but it starts with our Nova partners for the public safety building. They'll review it for the items that I spoke about above. Then it goes to the project engineer, project manager. Then it comes to the assistant director of public works. And then if the value of the change order is over $10,000, the director of public works must sign off on it. So I just wanted to give you kind of an outline of our internal process for projects. And I will turn it back over to Bob.
All right, excellent. So, as we mentioned here, we've included an example of our monthly status data, or our most current monthly status update in your packet tonight. So I'm going to direct you to page 18 in your packets so I can kind of walk through what this document is with you and cover what's in there. I'm going to pause just for a few seconds here to give everybody time to shuffle to the correct page, and I'll start walking through the report here. All right, I think we're probably ready at this point. So what we've included here is the monthly status update that we provide each month once we've finished our review. So after the title page, so we have a status overview that walks through what we performed in the current month, the results of that review, any open observations or requests for information, and then it also includes our upcoming activities along with a summary of all of the tasks we've completed to date. So as of the update included in the packet, we had reviewed basically all invoices for the contractors in scope of this audit through September 30th. So these were the invoices that essentially were then submitted to Public Works for review and approval in October, which means we received them and reviewed them in November. So the total amount of the project billings that we had reviewed for each of the contractors through this status update was approximately $22 million. So you'll notice in the report, so we actually have kind of two sets of observations that we report on. So we have a section called Audit Issues, and we have a section called Requests for Information. So Audit issues are exceptions that we've noted along the line, such as billing errors that may require future resolution. So as of this status update, you'll notice we've identified about $7,000 to date, which required credits or adjustments from the respective contractors. These were related to items such as fee calculation errors on some change orders, and a couple of billing rate errors where one of the consultants charged an incorrect rate for one of their individuals. So while we have had some exceptions at this point, I would point out that compared to the $22 million billed to date, we would consider these findings relatively minor, and I would like to point out too that they either have been corrected or in the process of being corrected. And then we also have a log that we attach to this as well too, which we call our request for information, or RFI log. And so what this log reflects then is any questions or inquiries we have on items that may not be clear with the support provided us for review. So typically these requests involve additional documentation to substantiate billings or change order pricing. And then depending on the initial response to the RFI item, so we also may have follow-up RFIs, which you can see documented in the current log, or it might result in an audit issue as well too. So we will maintain a running log throughout the project on both of these items, and so each month we also share these with Public Works and walk through any responses, any additional needed documentation, right? So that way, by the time we issue these items, the next go around, each of these items is resolved. So any questions on the status report?
Is that the end of the report?
That is everything I have, unless there's additional questions.
So before we officially turn it over for questions, I'll just cover the last slide, which is really a couple of kind of key considerations. Bob pointed out we've tested a total of $22.5 million at the time of issuance, or excuse me, at the time of the status report, which was mid-November, if I recall. And we've identified $7,000 in sort of question costs, so to speak. So again, relatively minor. I don't show the percentage, but it's very low. Second point, we've mentioned this a couple of times. Our intent is to continue to issue these monthly monitoring reports in accordance with our task order, which runs for a few more months. We didn't run for the duration of the project, but it runs for a couple more months. And then our intent is to have a conversation about continuing with this effort over time. And of course, we're asking for approval of this initial memo. And with that, we're ready for questions.
Okay, great. Thank you. Again, let me just check to see if there's any members of the public that would like to comment on this item. So if you would like to comment, raise your hand. And I'm not seeing any hands. So any council comments or questions, motions? So Kyle, I had a question you said there at the end. I mean, it's relatively early in the project. I would expect things to be kind of small at this point. It seems like as we get towards the end of the project, that's when we might see more change orders and issues. Rather than like continue this for a little bit longer and then end, would it make sense to pause this and just plan to do it at the end? Or it's too hard to catch up if you haven't kind of done the middle part, if that makes sense?
So I can sort of speak to that and ask Bob to chime in. I think, so we view this as a, relatively affordable risk management tool for the city. I think the monthly expense from our end is in the $3,000 to $5,000 range. So given the level of expense, not super large. to your point, though, we've only identified $7,000 in costs. So that's sort of a balancing act that we have to play. Ultimately, my recommendation would be to continue this through for, I think we have 3 or 4 months left on the task order. At that point, revisit that question. And in all likelihood, what we might recommend, to your point, is sort of a closeout audit, which would take place roughly 12 to 18 months. I'm forgetting the exact anticipated end date of the project itself. So continue down this path, ensure that what we're seeing thus far is, minimal level of error or issues, and then revisit the sort of scope of work here in a couple of months, and consider what you're describing, a closeout type of audit.
Well, I guess, was I also right, my assumption that things get more fast and furious towards the end, and that might be the time we see bigger change orders, or is it kind of even throughout our project? And really it's to Kyle and Holly and Brad. I mean, I would expect kind of the beginning of the project probably goes smoother, and as you go along, maybe you start to see things.
I think Brad probably is
They
best
wanna
equipped
take
to
it.
address that, and or Holly.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in and Holly can add on, but for a project like this, a lot of the change orders take place pretty early. Things like utility conflicts, unforeseen conditions with underground construction. And keep in mind, we just did that whole excavation and finished the initial foundation. For this project, there's a three-dimensional coordination tool being used by the contractor to basically look very closely at coordination for different types of building systems early on in the project. And we've actually been processing quite a few change orders that come from that process, where kind of different from what you might expect, we're dealing with some issues up front early in the project that should make it go more smoothly as we get later into the project, and avoid having those come up with issues while we're actually building those parts of the project.
Holly, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would add, I agree with what Brad said. We're using a program called BIM 360, which is Building Information Modeling. So it really does model the building, and it starts in the very bottom basement and works its way up. So it will tell you if a trade conflicts with another. So a water pipe is in the same place as an electrical pipe. So it'll tell you the conflicts right now. So we're nearly done with that. We're on the top floor. So we have identified a lot of the conflicts early on in the process. So we have processed a lot of change orders up front. So I would say it was mostly front loaded for the change orders. We hope to be smoother towards the middle and end of the project. Typically those conflicts aren't found out until you actually go to build it. So we're doing it really early with this modeling program.
That's really good to hear. And again, if we're doing a lot of changes up front, and again, those discrepancies have been small, I think that's also very positive. And then I guess the trick is just making sure the as-built matches the plans that match the fixes you've found so far. But okay, that's very helpful. So I'm supportive of the motion and continuing this, and Kyle's suggestion of, let's check in 3 or 4 months and then see whether we keep doing it or if we just do one towards the end. Councilmember Tanaka or Stone, do you guys have a comment? Greg?
So yeah, thanks for your work on this. I guess first question, so it's great that you guys found some issues. Did we actually recover the money from those issues that you guys found?
Yes, so this is Holly. The $300 some discrepancy on the change order has already been credited back to the city on a subsequent change order. And then the $6,700 discrepancy for Nova Partners, that was found early on in the contract back in 2017. And we just processed their November invoice this week, and the credit was put on their November invoice. So we now have both of them. And that will be reflected in Baker Tilly's probably next month's report.
Okay. And for the cost of this audit, can someone remind me, is this being funded from the public safety building fund, or is this being funded from our general fund?
I believe this is being funded from the general fund, from the
Shouldn't
city
this be
auditor's budget.
Okay, shouldn't this be funded from the public safety building? Because this is related to the public safety building, is it not?
It is, and we can pose that question to the Administrative Services Department to determine if we can reallocate costs.
I think that's it's an interesting question. Ultimately, the funding comes back to the city, so it's not a grant funded effort. I suppose one might question whether this would be qualified under the bond funding, which I don't think it should. So in effect, it's just really whether it comes out of one account versus another, both from the city.
It has to do with cost containment, because more stuff that's related to the public safety building that we put outside of the bond, essentially the more expensive this building becomes. So I guess I don't understand why you don't think this should be in the bond, because it's related to the public safety building. It's the expense of building the building. So I guess why would the bond not cover it?
Well, we'd be financing the cost of the audit work, and that doesn't necessarily, that may not necessarily pass an audit test. So it would be something that ASD could take a look at. But again, my point being that ultimately it's both from the city, and if anything, council member, if your concern is containing the cost and budgeting for the public safety building, this would actually add a cost to the budgeting for the public safety building.
Well, the bond is a finite size, and if you take money that should have been in the bond into the general fund, you're essentially making the cost more. So I don't understand your logic about why it would be costing the building more. If anything, it makes it smaller, because more expense that's kept in the public safety building bond, the less the building was going to cost, right? Because there's only so much money that bond has, right?
Happy to discuss that with you offline. I think this has been discussed. Happy to have administrative services take a look at where it should be budgeted, which is really the issue.
Okay, Kyle, do you know for other cities, like when you guys do audit work, let's say the city is doing something similar, building a building, is it typical that the audit charges are separated from the project, or are they usually bundled together with the project? Do you know? What's the common practice?
I can tell you from my experience, it depends. It depends on the city, right? It depends on the project and how it's being funded as well too. So I guess I don't have a very good answer for you right now, but I can tell you that I've seen it done both ways, and in this case, it depends. And so in the situation, I would have to defer.
Well, I for one like to see it together with the project, just because there's a certain amount of money that we allocated that was raised from the bond, and so I think any and all related expenses should be in there. That's my preference. I don't know the rest of my colleagues, but that's what I like to see.
And we appreciate that feedback, and we'll certainly speak with administrative services, legal, city manager department as needed to work through that issue.
Okay. And just out of curiosity, and I assume if, like, for instance, there was a like some sort of issue that came up, I mean, that, like, yeah, of course, like if there was extra expense, I would imagine that would also come from the bond, or would have to, at least, well, I guess the council would have to see whether it's approved or not, but I would assume that would come from the bond, right? I mean, are all expenses actually coming from the bond right now, or is that some of it coming from the general fund, or is it on a case-by-case basis?
So looking at sort of the sources of funds is not within the scope of our work, so I can't speak to that. I'm not certain if anyone on the line can or intends to.
I do believe all those current costs are coming from the bond, council member.
except for maybe the audit.
Correct.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you for confirming that. That's all I have.
Greer.
Well, first I just want to say, Robert, you've got the coolest background there. Those guitars, very nice. I mean, I think you've answered most of my questions, and the mayor had a couple of questions that that I had, so I appreciated that. I guess but my only comment, just a request from staff when printing out these reports. I couldn't read the draft status update on page 21 and on, because the print is just very, very small. So just a request in future packets. I was able to find, to get it online, and so it wasn't that big of a deal, but just to put out that request. But otherwise, I don't have any further questions. I'm happy to support. I think the mayor was making a motion. I'm happy to.
Go ahead, make it.
Okay, I'll move the staff motion.
I'll second. And Councilmember Tanaka, how do you vote?
Yes.
And Councilmember Stone?
Yes.
And I vote yes. All right, thank you. I think we're on to our last item, which is the discussion about council priorities and the council handbook.
Yes, thank you. I'll be doing a quick overview on this one. So we combined these two items this evening because on the council protocols and procedures document, staff is working in the background with a consultant on doing the document cleanup. So the city attorney's office, myself, and our communications team are working with an outside consultant for the council direction, I believe, from August. So we are cleaning that up, but we realized that this committee may have wanted to push forward any recommendations to the full council on new protocols and procedures that you had already generated ideas for. So I just put that out there today. There's no net new information from the last time this committee discussed that. I believe it was May or June. So if there's something that you wanted to push forward to the city council, it would be fine to include that in a motion so that it could be heard at the retreat. The other portion of this item is the annual occurrence where the Policy and Services Committee reviews the suggestions for the council priorities for the retreat. So the process has been that this committee, after staff solicits feedback from council members, that this committee reviews the list and does some sort of cleanup or reorganizing or some version of that to present to the full city council at your retreat in this case, early 2022. So I'll just briefly go over the list. We essentially push forward everything we received. If it was received from more than one person, we just noted that. So the list is longer, I think, than previous years. And looking at the notes last year, this committee had about 10 items, and the committee pushed all 10 of those to the council for the retreat. This year, we're at 18. So I'll briefly run through those. And as a reminder for the committee and the public, the 4 priorities for this current year are listed in the staff report on packet page 23. It's economic recovery, housing for social and economic balance, social justice, and climate change protection and adaptation. The priorities for 2020, which shifted because of COVID and many other things going on in the world, were housing with special emphasis on affordability, sustainability in the context of the changing climate, and improving mobility for all. And previous years to that are all on packet page 28 for reference for everyone. So just quickly going through the list we received upon soliciting city council on packet page 25. This is affordable housing with a note that if it's an ongoing thing that staff will work on, then obviously it can come off the list. Civility and respect in public discourse to reinforce a welcoming community with a sense of belonging for all community members. Climate change, protection and adaptation. This was mentioned by multiple council members. Development and support for community serving businesses, revitalizing shopping districts, economic recovery, healthy city, healthy community. There's some added language there. Housing for social and economic balance, mentioned more than one time. Implementation of the Sustainability and Climate Action Plan, or SCAP. Local economic development, partnering with housing partners to add a variety of housing types throughout the city. Post-pandemic fiscal sustainability, public safety, push back on state legislation that trumps local control, rebalance the infrastructure plan, redesign and streamline internal and external city processes to become more nimble, respond to significant changes in work location with fewer people coming to Palo Alto each day, and lastly, social justice. And one of those recommended priorities also factors in what the HRC has presented before to this committee of an interest in belonging or something tangential to that being a council priority next year. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Mr. Mayor, for discussion of what you all as a committee would like to push forward to council at next year's retreat.
Okay, and just let me check in with the public one last time. If any of the public would like to speak to this item, raise your hand. Okay, let's see, David Cole. David, you should be able to speak.
Thank you, Mayor and members of the committee. I wanted to reiterate what was brought up at last night's council meeting by Vice Mayor Pat Burt to include SCAP impact statements as part of future and relevant staff reports to City Council on items before the council. This is critical in making sure that we truly address our number one priority, which is likely to be the priority next year as well. Just as we have reports from city staff about how any project complies with the comp plan and SCAP were meant to be taken together as planning tools and guidance tools for the council. So this type of impact statement with regard to SCAP is very important in many ways. And so I would very much like to see this committee support that recommendation to council going forward. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We'll come back to council. Chantal, a quick discussion. So we approved this consultant in June. Would it be possible that there'd be a draft ready for the retreat that council could give feedback on?
We're working towards that. We're working towards it. It's the best description I can give. We know for sure we have a refined table of contents, and we think we'll have something to get a response from the council on at the retreat. I just don't want to overpromise just because the same team of us working on that have a couple other projects we're also working on. So we're trying to keep it moving.
I mean, if the consultant had a draft that council could discuss, even if it wasn't done, I think, and then sent that to policy and services, I think that would be useful. Okay. It's a great time to get a weigh in, and typically we do that at the retreat. We talk about our policies and procedures, protocols.
Yes, for sure. And the intention is for council to review it. So we will work towards that date with something. I just can't promise how elaborate it'll be.
Yeah, I'm just saying if it's not perfect, I think it's probably better to get whatever there is, even if it can be presented as a rough draft or whatever state it's in.
You mean a watermark that says rough draft? Just kidding. Yes.
Yeah, and even if it identified maybe topics for, like my understanding, it wasn't really to substantially change it, it was just to reformat it, make it clearer.
Correct. And to clean up pieces that are outdated or to identify those for the council. So just making sure that it is easier to use, and in that process, if there are things that are clearly no longer needed, we want to identify those so that they can be removed as well. But we wouldn't be making those decisions for the council. We would just be highlighting them.
And Greer?
Just a couple questions. So the guidelines for the selection of priority says that the prior, and you mentioned this as well, that the priorities generally have a 3-year time limit. So after a priority has been a priority for 3 years, it goes into like the work plan. So then it's just kind of considered an ongoing city priority that doesn't need to be specifically called out.
And I'll look to Mr. Shikata for this as well. So that's been the practice. I know some have still resurged, I would say, as a priority. If we look at the historical list, like transportation in some form or another has been on there, but we've taken it as work that's ongoing and we continue to do the work if it's not done on a priority year. Ed, would you like to add to that?
And I'm sorry, I missed the question, so I have to beg forgiveness on that.
Sorry about that.
No worries. And it's just about when a priority has been a priority for 3 years, does it then how does that process work with it just kind of becoming a permanent kind of work item for the city?
To a certain extent, that's accurate. At the same time, I think that 3 years has been somewhat, as Ms. Gaines pointed out, flexible in things like grade separation, which we know take more than 3 years to come to fruition.
I think we've been pretty rigorous about it. Like, you know, we did housing for 3 years, then we took a year off, and then housing came back a year after that. And yeah, I mean, and I do think council looks at it. It's like, if it's a priority every year, you know, is it really a priority? It's kind of the thinking.
Yeah, so I'm wondering then on climate change. I mean, especially with the work we're doing on SCAP, and I mean, climate change has been listed for the last 3 years. I mean, what's the benefit if we list it again? Because I mean, I think Tom makes a good point as far as if everything's a priority, then nothing is a priority, and so is there a need for us to continue to make that a priority, or it's been on there for 3 years now, not necessary?
I'll give you a personal perspective, not having been with the city for 6, that I think your point, Councilmember, really speaks to the value of perhaps focusing the priority rather than perhaps climate change in general terms, to be more specific about what the council's interest and really goal might be, as tight as a single year, if not perhaps a slightly more expansive time period in mind.
That's helpful. Thank you. And I appreciate your quick, concise responses tonight, Ed. I got my booster this afternoon. It's starting to sink in. I'm starting to get the fatigue, but I'm okay. I'm gonna make it through. And then, sorry. Let's see. And one more question. Can staff weigh in on that on from the discussion from last night regarding an SCAP impact statement on staff reports? I think Ed, I think you said last night this would be a good discussion for policy and services. So I am just kind of curious your initial thoughts on that, as far as just how practical is that? What additional burden would that place on staff? How beneficial would it be for council to be able to have that impact statement? Or I guess what I'm saying is, I'm not interested in something that's just a feel good, let's check the box, say, hey, we're paying attention to climate change and SCAP, if at the end of the day it's not going to actually help us in our decision making. But I do think overall, the intent is really good and the idea behind it is great, because I have always found it frustrating that we have these SCAP goals and yet we might be doing A, B, and C that just sets us further back. So I don't know if staff, if you could weigh in on that.
Sure. I'll give you a quick perspective. I want to be quick here. first, appreciate your raising the issue because it is really one, I'll call it a question of adding value versus something of a distraction, where on the distraction side, it's a question of when does it apply and when doesn't it apply? And that's really something of a judgment call. And quite frankly, I would expect it may be debatable in many cases, reflecting on some of the discussions that have come up on, again, the role of concrete. So would it be anything that where we're expending city funds on a concrete project? Is that, again, how do we assess that, and what do we state with respect to positive, negative, what are the trade-offs and the like? So to a certain extent, it can become a bit of a creative writing exercise. So in order to be effective, we would have to be pretty clear on expectations of what staff would do in completing that discussion point. And I think that could be a bit challenging. And final thought is, what we certainly don't want to do is add more process to our production of staff reports, where quite frankly that slows us down. And whether it be the comprehensive plan, policy implications, and consistency, or others that are an additional step in getting a staff report to the city council, which, if we could be focused, would be great, but it's the unintended consequence of the volume of reports that can get caught up and again, just slow the organization down.
Okay, yeah, I think those are all really good points, and it seems kind of still too early on in the process to really have a strong understanding of the impact and those unintended consequences. So I do think this is something worthy of us looking into a little closer. I think there's positives and negatives with the idea, but overall, I think it sounds interesting to me. And yeah, I mean, I think where I'm at, I agree with I agree with kind of taking climate change and trying to focus this a little more for focus areas for next year's and for next year and goals. Affordable housing, we've had it on there for 2 years now. I think we should really promote that. I think that should continue to be one of our top goals for next year. And I am interested in looking at local economic development, kind of continuing to help improve the economy and local businesses and retail as well. But I also think the idea of what the HRC recommended as far as belonging, if that can be incorporated into one of our 3 policies, I think that's always an important goal. So I think that's kind of where I'm at. I don't really know if staff is how I guess I'm a little confused on this item, what you're looking for from us tonight.
Yeah, this one's really tricky because it's a discussion amongst yourselves of what you want to send to yourselves in January. But I'd say this list is long. So if there's a combining or these topics seem to be the same thing, that may be useful for the committee today. And if you had some strong opinions, that's also fine. But the full council will have this discussion at the retreat. So you're kind of doing pre-work for the full council.
Yeah, I could jump in maybe.
Oh yeah, please go ahead.
So, I think there were 5. Wasn't clear if you counted number 9 as one of the 5 on climate change, or was it a 6 total?
I had that one as separate just because it's specifically called out the SCAP. So that is something that could be combined. But yeah, that would be.
So 6 of 7 wanted something around climate change.
Correct.
I think maybe, something like accelerator climate change plans, but I think it would really help to just group these. So, looking at it, I saw 5 climate change plus that one, at the top. I see at least 5 around post-pandemic economic recovery. And so again, I think if you could group all of the items 4, 5, 10, 12, 17, in a cluster. And then I saw 3 around affordable housing for social economic balance. It's like 1, 8, and 11. And again, I think these are in order of popularity. And then Healthy Cities had 2, and Belonging Social Justice had 2. And then you could just list all the single ones at the bottom. But like, I just think that kind of presentation would be good. So there'd be like 6 at the top, and then 5, and then 3, and then 2, 2, 1, 1, 1. Because it is a really long list, and you have to read it. And a lot of them, I think, are around the same issue or the same thing. And so it'll help the council a lot to see that 6 out of 7 of us had something about climate change. And we can get specific there at the retreat about being more specific than just saying climate change. So that would be my suggestion, is really just around formatting. And I think that's what you're asking for tonight, right?
Yes, that suffices, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, the whole list will go to the council, right? And if anybody wants to argue for something that was just one item, they can do that if they can convince more people, right? Does that make sense, Greg and Greer?
Yep.
So-
Did any of you guys have like specific things around the protocols? Like, I kind of want to see the edit before adding things in or suggesting things myself, but I haven't been looking at it recently. You guys might have.
I have nothing specific on that tonight.
Okay.
Yeah, me neither.
So Chantal, do you need a motion, or can you just kind of take this as like study session feedback and take it from there?
Ed unmuted at the same time. I'll defer to him first.
Actually, I was going to answer that question directly. I did want to perhaps pose the question for the committee on this issue, somewhat closely related to this number 2 on the civility and respect in public discourse. Among staff, we had, as a part of the council's race and equity priority, been looking at, I think it's training. We're describing it as training for the boards and commissions. And one question was the council's interest in having a segment of the retreat, perhaps bring in a speaker on this topic, and again, have that be an integral part of the retreat at the beginning of the year as something of a lead-in to what will be happening with the boards and commissions. So I just wanted to note that for the committee to see if you'd like to discuss that here or something to punt for next year. And Chantal, just want to make sure that I captured that accurately.
Yep.
I mean, I'll just speak for myself. I think it's generally been a pretty civil year this year. And I would defer to the new mayor, like whatever the new mayor wants to do with the retreat. If he or she had a different idea, I think we should allow some flexibility.
I think that sounds reasonable to me to defer to next year's mayor on that. I mean, I like the idea, but so if it was up to me, I would say yes, but I agree with Tom. I think that's a decision for the mayor.
That's fine.
Great. So we'll keep working on that in the background just so that we are prepared and scoping it in a way that makes the most sense for the new mayor, because it comes upon us fast in January and we want to make sure we're not scrambling at the last minute.
Yep.
And then in terms of your question about the motion, in years past, the committee has still gone ahead and taken a vote just to say that you're pushing forward the list. So in this case, if you wanted to say that you're pushing forward a cleaned up version of this list, that's fine. Like for staff to categorize these, and I think that's fine.
Yeah, I'll make the motion that you cluster the similar topics together and present a cleaned up list to council.
Second.
Okay, thank you. And so we'll vote. Councilmember Tanaka.
Yes.
Stone,
Yes.
yeah, and I vote yes. So
Got it. We will work on that. Thank you.
I think that's it, right?
You did it.
And that is the end of policy and services for 2021. All right, thank you guys. Meeting adjourned.
Fun. Happy holidays.
Congratulations. Thank you.
Holidays.
Happy holidays.
Night, everyone. Thanks.